Now, I'm going to be speaking to a former representative to the UK of both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. First, let's hear from Daniel Taub, who served as Israeli ambassador to the UK from 2011 to 2015. He joins me from Tel Aviv, and thank you so much for making the time for us today, and I hope you're staying safe there in Israel. First of all, do you have a message for the British people this morning from Israel, and perhaps particularly for the Jewish community in the United Kingdom?
Hi, Tom. Good to be with you. Just to clarify, I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, not from Tel Aviv, just down the road. I think my message to the Jewish community and to the general British population is actually the same message. We are going through one of the darkest times that Israel has had, but one of the points of light is the absolute moral clarity that we are seeing from our friends and leaders, throughout Europe, the United States, and so on. There's a tremendous amount of suffering and grief within Israel, and we know that Palestinians are also suffering. But there is no equivalence, no way of making a comparison between Israelis who are doing everything they can to save the lives of Israelis and limit the damage to civilians in the Gaza Strip, and Hamas, this terrorist organization that targets civilians in the Israeli side and brutally abuses Palestinians on the other side. So we really call for people to hold fast to that clarity at this point in time.
There, of course, can be no equivalence made between the prescribed terror group Hamas and the democratic state of Israel. There have, however, been criticisms of the way in which Israel has been conducting its response, particularly when it comes to cutting off water and electricity supplies. Politicians in the United Kingdom have sort of flip-flopped on their support for this measure. Is it going too far?
As you know, we have been working very closely with the international community to try and make sure that supplies, humanitarian access, reaches the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip, particularly in the south. But we're also aware that to date, in the 16 years since Israel pulled out of every inch of the Gaza Strip, humanitarian aid, and that's including European aid, has been hijacked and abused by the Hamas terrorist organization. And I, Tom, don't know any country that would continue to supply electricity to a territory where terror organizations are using that same electricity to build, manufacture, and fire the missiles that's in firing on Israeli civilians.
I suppose the problem here is it's so difficult to tell the embedded Hamas terror groups within Gaza from the hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. And isn't that the crux of the problem, that given the right of Israel to defend itself and the strikes that have been made, there will, of course, be innocent civilians tied up in this? How does Israel navigate that path?
So first of all, the crux of the problem, sadly, is that we have an Iranian-sponsored terrorist organization embedded in the Gaza Strip, taking its own population hostage. But you're right, Tom, to focus on the fact that not only does it abuse our civilians, the atrocities that we've seen, the abuse of firing people with inside, shooting at people with inside ambulances, but in the Gaza Strip, it claims to have 100,000 militants. None of them wear uniforms. None of them separate themselves from the civilian population. In those circumstances, we do everything we can to try and separate the civilians. We've been urging the civilians to move south so they'll be out of the area of entrenched terrorist occupation there in the Gaza Strip. Sadly, we know that Hamas is forcing many of them to stay. It's locking some of them up. I heard this morning that it is actually throwing away people's car keys. I mean, that's a horrendous situation, but we cannot allow this tactic to succeed. And we need to keep our minds on the fact that after this war is over, the situation, not just for Israelis, but for the people of Gaza, will be infinitely better if Hamas, this terrorist, brutal organization, is not embedded within this area.
I suppose one of the problems here is that there is a genuine sense of fear from people in Gaza, perhaps people who have been driven to more extreme means because the progress towards a two-state solution simply hasn't been being made. In many ways, things have been going backwards. Does Israel still believe in a two-state solution?
So, Tom, I think we need to get the history right here. You know, if you remember, Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip entirely. At that time, there were no restrictions on the Gaza Strip. The border with Egypt was run by an EU mission called the EU-BAM mission. You know, Palestinians had free passage of trade and so on and so forth. And it was only the fact that Hamas used the territory that we pulled out of to launch repeated attacks against us that actually meant that restrictions were necessary. The original plan when Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip was to lead to further withdrawals, to try and advance a peace treaty or peace arrangement between Israelis and Palestinians. But I think you're right. When Israelis look today and they see that every area that Israel has pulled out of, whether it's the Gaza Strip, whether it's in South Lebanon, and we've pulled out in return for promises from the international community and the hope that the local populations will actually use this as an opportunity for prosperity. And instead, we've seen Iranian-sponsored proxies actually using these areas as basis for repeated attacks against Israel. I have to say the prospects for further withdrawals don't look promising.
Now, of course, you conducted negotiations with the Palestinian Authority around the time of that withdrawal from Gaza. Do you now see that withdrawal as a mistake, given it clearly led to the rise of Hamas?
If you remember, it didn't immediately lead to the rise of Hamas. You know, it was 2 years later. The Hamas actually had a sort of fictitious win in elections and then brutalized the regime, threw the Palestinian Authority officials off the roofs and so on and so forth. The fact is, a peace will not keep itself. A peace needs to be maintained with effort from both sides. Sadly, we haven't seen the will from the Palestinian Authority to take a firm hand both against the Hamas terrorist organizations and against the indoctrination of its own children. Sadly, we know that there are a generation of youngsters that have been taught that jihad, that suicide bombers, is one of the highest values. I mean, it's a horrendous form of child abuse that you send your child to school and the people that are held up as its heroes are these jihadi suicide bombers. When we see young Palestinians brought up to actually hold up constructive models of heroism, people who have tried to build their society rather than pull down ours, I think Israelis will have a greater confidence in the possibility of peace.
It seems peace in the Middle East is a lot further away today than it was perhaps a month ago. Ironically, it might well have been the march towards normalization of relations with Israel and surrounding countries, an extension of those Abraham Accords that sparked this horrific Hamas terror attack in the first place, likely promoted by Iran. Can you see in your lifetime any normalization, any de-escalation of the clear tensions that have come so forthright in the last 2 weeks?
So I think we do have to hold fast to the possibility of hope. I mean, I think if you look in our region, one of the lessons that we can learn is that it's very hard to reach peace. But when you do reach peace, it's more resilient than you might have thought. We have peace treaties with Egypt and with Jordan, which have held fast despite the Arab Spring and all sorts of upheavals in the region. We have, as you pointed out, Tom, we have peaceful relations with a number of Gulf states. We have a very important rapprochement process with Saudi Arabia, which may itself have been part of the Iranian calculus. It is so clear to anybody who looks at the region that if you are forward-looking, if you care about your children, peace brings such extraordinary dividends in terms of cooperation, in terms of shared resources. We just need to try and strengthen those people who care more about their children than destroying ours.
Well, Daniel Taub, I thank you so much for your participation in the programme.